Hello everyone, welcome to today's session called Leading from a Distance, How to Lead, Motivate and Take Care of Remote Workers. This session is one of 12 webinars hosted by the Field Fisher EPIC team. For those of you that don't know, that stands for Employment, Pensions, Immigration and Compliance. We will be hosting a 30-minute session every Tuesday at 1 p.m. covering various hot topics. We are delighted to start the series with a guest speaker, Dr. Mike Drayton. Mike is an organisational consultant, executive coach and clinical psychologist. He is also a fellow of the Cabinet Office Emergency Planning College. Mike specialises in leadership and resilience. He has worked with national and international companies as well as public sector organisations. If you have any questions for Mike, please use your questions box in your control panel on the right-hand side of the screen. I will then collate the questions and ask Mike as many of them as I can at the end of his presentation. All our sessions are recorded and will be available on the Field Fisher website and our YouTube channel. So let's get started. Mike, over to you.
Thank you, Ranjit, and hi everyone. I'm glad you can join me. Well, these are strange and interesting times, aren't they? Could you have possibly imagined at the start of this year that most of us would be working from home and socially isolating? What's happened over the past couple of months has been really shocking, hasn't it? It's been life-changing, and it's not over yet. And because it's all been so sudden and unpredictable, I guess many of you won't have had much time to prepare for this massive change in how we work. So if you feel a bit unsettled about this situation, you're right to, because leading a remote team is very different from leading a team in your office. It requires a different mindset, a different way of thinking about how you organize the work, and more importantly, about all the relationship issues that can arise. You may have heard Boris Johnson talk about his roadmap for coming out of lockdown. Well, what I'd like to do in this webinar is give you a very simple roadmap to help you as a leader and a manager get through this crisis. These are some of the questions that I'll answer in this webinar. There's a lot of literature in the crisis management field that shows how people generally react in a crisis. I thought it might be useful to have a quick look at that to help you predict what might happen with the people you manage. Next, I'd like to talk about some of the practicalities of managing a remote working team, things like IT and workflow. Then I'll move on to motivation. I mean, how can you motivate people over Zoom? As well as motivation, I'll talk a bit about well-being and what you can do to keep your remote workers psychologically well. I'll also mention what you can do, both as an individual and as a management team, to support yourselves and keep yourselves well. If you're not able to look after yourself, you won't be able to look after other people, will you? Finally, I want to say a bit about strategy and planning for the future. Things are going to be very different in the future, and we need to be thinking about that now. Now, by the way, what I'm going to be telling you about is based on research in the behavioural and psychological sciences. It's not just my opinion, it's not just pop psychology. So I hope that sounds good. Excellent, good. Well, let's move on. A couple of years ago, I worked on a project with the Emergency Planning College called People in Emergencies, looking at how we can support communities after a major crisis. When I was doing that work, I came across a really interesting piece of research looking at how large groups of people are affected by crises. One thing that psychology research teaches us is that although people can be quite irrational, human behaviour is highly predictable, as you will see. Here's a 2015 research by Math and colleagues. It's a meta-analysis of all the research on disaster management between 1978 and 2013. What they found was that individuals and groups react to a crisis and follow a number of predictable phases. They called these the heroic phase, the honeymoon phase, the disillusionment phase, and the restoration phase. If you look at the image on the screen, you can see the bottom axis measures time and the vertical axis measures energy levels. And by energy levels, I mean physical, emotional, and psychological energy. If you look to the left of the screen, you'll see that When the crisis strikes, there's a slight dip. This is when people feel shocked and surprised by events. Then there's an immediate upsurge in energy. Math called this the heroic phase. In this period, people want to help. They're thinking, well, it's all hands to the pump. It can be quite exciting. This is when lots gets done. You may have been surprised by how quickly your organisation has been able to seamlessly shift to online working. Now that's usually a function of the heroic phase. This tends to last about a week before settling down into an adaptation phase. Math called this the honeymoon phase. This is where people start working from home and getting used to using the technology like Zoom. It's still a bit of a novelty and people feel quite excited. They are a bit apprehensive, but getting used to things. People are thinking, well, this isn't too bad, I can manage this. The soundtrack to this phase would be Gloria Gaynor's I Will Survive. There is stress in both these phases, but it's acute stress and can be quite energizing. And this phase lasts up to about 8 weeks. Unfortunately, the adaptation phase is a bit of a honeymoon period because sooner or later we, metaphorically speaking, fall off the edge of the cliff into a much longer period of disillusionment and chronic stress. I think that's where we are now, just peeking over the edge of the disillusionment cliff. I've spoken to some of my clients recently who tell me that they're starting to notice a change in attitude and behaviour in those they manage. A big problem seems to be the conflict between work demands and home demands, especially with people who are having to deal with homeschooling. Those affected the most seem to be leaders who want to protect their direct reports from their own anxiety and don't want to talk about their worries at home to the family who are stressed enough already. This disillusionment phase can last for a long time. During this period, people are feeling generally fed up and some feel detached from work. This is where you'll see a rise in mental health problems and perhaps even litigation. Now, good leadership in this disillusionment phase is absolutely critical. Also, it's worth mentioning that on top of everything else, this is the phase where you need to be thinking strategically and planning for the future. The last phase the researchers noted was the recovery phase where things start to get back to normal. Hopefully that will be a matter of months rather than years away. It's important to know this research because people in your business are likely to follow a similar trajectory. And if you know roughly which phase you're in, it will help you understand and manage people's behaviour. It will also help you to avoid surprises. So what can you do? First of all, here are a few practical things that you might be able to do. Well, actually, preparing for this webinar, I realised that one of the major sources of stress is the technology associated with home working. I mean, this is pretty obvious advice, but I think the first place to start is making sure that everybody working from home has got the technology they need, and probably more importantly, that they know how to use it. You should check this out carefully with people. A lot of people don't like asking for help. They think, if I ask for help, they'll think I'm stupid. Once you've done this, think carefully about how you organise your meetings to avoid Zoom fatigue. Recent research published in the Harvard Business Review by Rydell and Woolley found that remote teams who communicate in short bursts of activity mixed with periods of intense individual focus perform far better than teams whose communication is less structured. They called this bursty communications. What works best is rapid bursts of communication followed by longer periods of uninterrupted deep work. I was talking to a client last week who'd been in back-to-back Zoom meetings for most of the day, and this really isn't good. It's exhausting and doesn't help either performance or mental well-being. I think the hardest part in managing a remote team is motivation, in how to keep people motivated who are working online. Now, the first point on the screen seems to completely contradict what I've just said, but it doesn't, and let me explain why. Even day-to-day changes at work tend to make employees anxious. We're now facing unimaginable change. People are away from their workplaces and their friends and colleagues, and businesses are facing an existential threat, which doesn't escape the notice of people working for that business. People are worried about their jobs. Now, all of these factors will send people's anxiety levels through the roof. Now, psychology tells us that when people get anxious, they look for support and guidance from authority figures in their life. In other words, from you. Now, this is really tough because you might also be feeling quite anxious. So the first thing you need to do is to protect your employees from your own anxiety and give them lots of guidance, reassurance and support. You can do this by giving regular updates and messages. You need to try and find a balance between being realistic, acknowledging people's worries and providing a hopeful message for the future. You need to be saying something like, yes, I realise things are really unsettled at the moment, but this situation, like every situation, isn't permanent and things are going to change for the better. It's that balance between acknowledging anxiety and giving hope. That's the key to motivation. Now, you can do this by being more present for your workforce. This doesn't mean engaging them in relentless Zoom meetings. It can mean just having 3 regular updates a day, perhaps giving an update on ongoing projects and asking people how they are. The point is to be psychologically and emotionally present for the people you manage. I think the second key to motivation is summed up by the word boundaries. Another factor that generally helps people who are anxious is having a clear set of boundaries around their life. They might not be able to predict the future in the long term, but if they can at least predict how their day is going to be, that really helps. So my next bit of advice is to have clear start and finish and break times built into the working at home day. For example, you might want to announce when you arrive at the office, so to speak, at whatever time that might be, let's say 7 AM. You send out a message to say, I'm at work, which lets people know that they can contact you. Similarly, at the end of the day, let people know that you're going home, which might sound a bit silly really because you're already at home, but you get my point. Having prescribed break times as well is important. Try and fit these in with flexible working as best you can. One of the advantages of working from home is being able to work when it suits you, perhaps early in the morning, maybe even have a nap in the afternoon. I mean, you couldn't get away with that in the office, could you? So as a leader, try not to disrupt this too much. There was a really interesting piece of research in the Harvard Business Review by Barbara Larson and colleagues. This emphasised the importance of establishing regular, scheduled, structured daily check-in meetings and clear expectations and ways of working. In other words, being extra clear about what output you expect from your remote workers. In other words, give people clear deadlines for their work. Of course, you need to take into account people's circumstances when doing this. If they're homeschooling children, getting stuff done might be a lot more difficult. The final tip for motivation is to do your best to create a culture of appreciation. When people are working from home, they get less feedback from their manager, and you need to counter this by upping your levels of positive feedback for people's work. In fact, I'd advise you to be a bit over the top, if anything. To use a metaphor, it's a bit like you telling them from a distance they've done okay. And if you're at a distance, you have to shout a bit, metaphorically speaking. Another technique you can use is from Martin Seligman and the positive psychology movement. Once a week, put 10 minutes aside at your team meeting and ask all of the members to tell you 3 things that went well that week. This will help them focus on the positives of the situation rather than just the negatives. Most of us have a negative bias and tend to focus on the worries rather than the good things that have happened. This exercise helps to recalibrate things a bit. Finally, build in some social interaction. One of the biggest problems in remote working is a feeling of isolation and social disconnection. So as a leader, it's important that you encourage opportunities for informal social interaction. This will support team cohesion and a sense of belonging, which otherwise can quickly dissolve in a crisis situation. Pair people up to have 15-minute online coffee breaks where the only rule is no talking about work. Try and organise some quizzes, that kind of thing. Now, motivation is very closely linked to looking after people's mental health. When people work from home, supervision rapidly declines and Much of the subtlety and richness of face-to-face communications gets lost. Also, most of the interactions tend to finish on business or task issues. I've talked about this already a little bit. So it's important when you talk to people online to make sure you build in some friendly personal interactions, just as you would if you were in the office. It's important also to remember that everybody is different. We all have different personalities. It's sometimes too easy to make the assumption that everybody is similar to us, when of course most people are very different to us. This is where an understanding of personality helps. If you're a very extroverted person, you'll find working from home difficult because you get most of your energy from interacting with other people. If you're introverted, you might find working at home much easier, or maybe not. If you're introverted and you're stuck in a small house with a partner and 3 small children, working at home might be a living hell for you because you can't escape the company of other people. So just remember, everybody is different, and take that into account. Boundaries are important to well-being. Give people explicit permission to have some downtime. Some people will be good at being able to switch off, others will find it harder. It's important as a leader to explicitly tell people, give them permission that they should be having breaks and time away from work. Be aware of any subtle changes in how a person is working or interacting. If they become very slow at responding to emails when they normally respond quickly, or if they're very quiet in a teleconference when they're normally quite active, these are all clues that things might not be right with them. If you do notice something like this, you need to ask them about it, maybe in a phone call. But if you do, you should ask them twice. The first time you ask, they're likely to say that they're all right. But if you ask a second time, perhaps pointing out that you've noticed a change in how they've been, they're much more likely to respond honestly and tell you what's bothering them. Now, the final thing I want to talk about is how you, as a leader, can manage your own stress levels. When I wrote my book on burnout, I found that the biggest factor that protected people from burning out
Right, we've just lost your voice, yeah.
Yeah, was the ability to switch off from work. In other words, successful people work very hard when they're at work, but when they finish, they can immediately switch their attention to things outside of work, such as family or hobbies. A person on the road to burnout will be cooking a meal or trying to get to sleep and will be still thinking about work. The person who avoids burnout will be cooking a meal and focusing mindfully on the food they're cooking and will have forgotten work. This is the biggest and most robust finding in the literature on avoiding burnout. Have strict boundaries between work and personal life and make a real effort to make sure you switch off when you finish. Personal support is also very difficult for leaders. As I've already said, you don't want to offload your stresses onto those people you manage or to family members. I recently worked with an international team of managers who were undergoing quite a bit of stress because of business changes. I suggested that they form a peer support group to support each other emotionally and learn from each other. They meet for an hour once every 2 weeks and feel safe to offload to their colleagues, and they find that to be very successful. Finally, I'll say a few words about planning for the future. This crisis is not going to go on forever, but when it ends, it may be a very different world and different business environment. Now's the time to be thinking about this and innovating. You do this by thinking, and in order to think clearly, you need to carve out some time and space in which to think. As a leader, that's the main thing you get paid for, your ability to think clearly. Think about this experience and what seems to be going well. Think about how you can hang on to that in the future. Also, don't forget to ask people. Ask them what they feel works and what doesn't work, because their perception might be very different to yours. You don't necessarily have to agree with them, but you never know, you might actually learn something. The main thing is to be proactive rather than just reactive to the crisis. So I can see we're running out of time, so I'll just stop there. Thanks very much, everyone.
Great, thank you very much, Mike. So everyone, this is an opportunity to ask questions. If you use the question panel on your screen and send through some questions. Mike, I've got a few already. Shall I start with this one? And the question is, the question is, my team seem to be split into two groups. Those that seem to get lots done working from home and other people who hardly seem to get anything done. How do I manage those who are performing poorly at home?
That's a great question, thank you. First of all, I'll mention all the obvious things. You need to talk to them, ask them what their circumstances are, ask them if they have, children who they're having to, who are homeschooling, ask them if they've got a partner who's ill, that kind of thing. So there might be real reasons why they're not getting things done. I think once you've got beyond that, you need to think about, I talked earlier about personality and extroversion and introversion and so on. Another one of the 5 factors that make up our personalities is conscientiousness. If you're a leader, you're probably very high on conscientiousness, and that breaks down into 2 sub-factors, which are industriousness, which is the ability to work hard, and orderliness, which is being organized and getting things organized. Now, some people are not as high on conscientiousness as others. So I think the thing about home working, it throws a spotlight on people like this. So your members of staff who are not working particularly efficiently might be low on conscientiousness and might need a lot more support. And you support people like who are low on conscientiousness like this. The first thing you do is, again, to hark back to what I said earlier, give them very strict boundaries and deadlines. So if you think a piece of work would take 4 hours to complete, give them 5 hours to do it and say, look, I'd like this on my desk at 4 p.m. by tomorrow, or whatever time that will be after 5 hours. So give them very clear boundaries so they know where they are. The second thing is they might need a lot more help and support in organizing their time. They might need a timetable or schedules to work with. People are good at organising themselves, other people are less good at organising themselves. So you might need to give them extra support in organising themselves. And of course, ultimately, this crisis is not going to last forever and people will end up back in the office. And if things don't improve, you can use the kind of standard disciplinary procedures and performance management procedures.
Great, thank you. I've got another question that's come in. Is there a quick organisational survey for measuring stress or pressure levels?
Yeah, I think it's called asking people. I'm not a great believer, which might sound odd being a psychologist, in surveys and things like that. I think it's better just to kind of ask people and talk to people and kind of soak up your atmosphere yourself if you're a leader.
Okay, and I'm just going to keep going with the questions. Let's see how many we can get through. So the next one, what's your advice for how HR should engage with managers at a time like this? For example, should we be providing learning content to support them on remote working, whole surgeries so we can hear issues? What's worked well in your opinion?
What's worked really well in my experience, in my opinion, is holding surgeries, because I think the problem with offering training and I think perhaps fairly practical training might help, like in how to use Zoom and things like that. But beyond that, I think training just kind of overloads people. But what really helps is for a manager to know that they can perhaps approach their HR leader with questions in the context of a surgery. So, for example, you might have a surgery at 2 p.m. every Thursday for an hour, where managers can approach HR leaders and just ask them questions that have arisen, or ask for help with issues that have arisen during the working at home period. So I think surgeries are really helpful, actually, because it gives control back to the managers as well and doesn't try and impose expertise on them.
Great. I've got another question here. I've got a great senior leadership team, but lately they seem to have lost confidence, become very dependent, constantly asking me to approve the decisions they've made. I don't really want to do this. How should I handle that situation?
Oh, that's a good question. And funnily enough, it's a question that I've been asked a couple of times, over the last couple of weeks. Well, first of all, the thing not to do is A, tell them what to do, or B, tell them to go away and get on with it. I found the best approach is to ask them what their thoughts are. So what do you think you should be doing in this situation? And let them explain things. And when they've finished explaining things, you could ask them again, do you have any other thoughts about what you can do? Now, in that process helps people to think through the issues that they might be facing and come to a decision themselves. And then you can just confirm, as long as you kind of agree with what they've come up with, you can say to them, that sounds like a good idea to me, off you go, you see. And when they've carried out the decision, the thing to do then is to give them lots of praise and reinforcement to say, you've done a really good job, that was a good call, well done. And that's going to build up their confidence. And I think the other thing to say about that is to kind of normalize that process, because lots of people feel very anxious in this situation, and some people, react to anxiety by becoming very kind of uncertain about things, I suppose.
I've got another question here. It started part way through. So it says, working at home versus face-to-face in the office. There is a strong possibility that we get addicted to remote working and the cost savings. How would you counter this, if at all?
That's a good question. I think it's important to think about things, just think things through, because remote working can be great for people. It can give them lots of flexibility. They save time they save time in commuting. There are often less interruptions at home, so it can be very positive. But you also lose lots of things, I think, in remote working, such as kind of creativity and innovation, and people go to work for lots of reasons. They don't just go to work for money. Lots of people go to work for the companionship and the stimulation and so on. So I think a good way forward would be to look at how you can kind of combine the best of both ways of working. So maybe partly working at home and having a few days in the office. But I think the key thing to think about is outcomes and performance. And if working at home improves performance, then it's a good thing. I think it generally does, but not for everyone. Again, going back to the idea of personality, some people love working from home, other people find it quite difficult.
Okay, so I think last question, just quickly bearing in mind the time, how can I manage a direct report who tells me they are feeling low, but they don't know why?
That's a good question.
We haven't got very long now.
Okay, very quickly. When people experience an emotion, when they have a feeling, there's usually a thought attached to that feeling. So it's not very helpful to say, how are you feeling? They say, I feel terrible, I feel low. But it is helpful to say, when you're feeling low, what kind of thoughts go through your mind? For example, the thought might be, well, I don't think I'm performing very well at the moment. Or the thought might be, I'm worried about losing my job. Now, that's something as a leader you can address. You can address the thought that underpins the feeling rather than the feeling itself.
Great. Okay, so I'm going to just stop the questions there, and bearing in mind the time. However, if you do have questions which I haven't managed to read out, please do send them in, and we'll try and get an answer to you. So, Mike, thank you very much for joining us and kicking off our series. Everyone who attended, thank you. We hope you found it useful. Don't forget, all our sessions are recorded and available on our website and our YouTube channel. And somebody has sent a question saying, will the slides be circulated? They'll be available with the recording on the website and YouTube channel. Any more questions, do let us know. In the meantime, please do keep safe. And I hope you can join us for next week's webinar, which is called Easing the Lockdown, Challenges for Employers, Remote and On-Site Working, which is very topical since Boris Johnson announced on Sunday our plan to ease the lockdown in the UK. So our colleagues, Alex Watson and Richard Branson, will be running that session, and you've got there the dates and topics for all the other sessions. Thank you all. Stay safe. Goodbye.